Can you take two mythic periods of English history, Camelot on the one side, Sherwood Forest and Robin Hood on the other, mush them together like peanut butter and chocolate and create an RPG setting? That's what we're going to talk about today as we look at a setting called Shadows of Camelot for Shadowdark RPG. Today is a twofer review day featuring two items from William at Runeforged Tabletop Gaming. In addition to the Shadows of Camelot setting, we're going to look at a one-shot adventure called The Wicked Witch of the Woods. Welcome to my channel. I'm John. I'm a longtime referee of these dungeon crawling type games and a current fan of Shadowdark. So the first thing, Shadows of Camelot does not take place in England. It takes place in Albion. And we know Albion is the Celtic Roman name of England from late antiquity. Here it represents this mythical place that's 100 years after the time of King Arthur. Many figures of Arthurian lore show up here, except it's 100 years later, so they're either cursed to be immortal, they're undead, or they're maybe imprisoned in stasis. A villain of the past, Morgan Le Fay, is seeking an artifact to resurrect Mordred, her and Arthur's evil son. Current events involve the missing Richard the Lionhearted, who's off on crusade. Meanwhile, Prince John has usurped the throne. The sheriff has usurped Robin's castle, and Robin lives in the woods with his merry men trying to figure out how to fight back. Maid Marian is imprisoned, and this forms the early phase of a potential campaign. Now, there's great potential here if you love 1950s Errol Flynn movies, or perhaps Excalibur from the 1980s is your favorite Arthurian movie. Me, I read T.H. White's The Once and Future King in high school, and that book has stayed with me my whole life. I know I've read it at least once or twice since then, so I love Arthurian folklore, and so this one resonated with me. Apparently, it's resonated with other players too. It's a silver seller over at DriveThruRPG. So let's go ahead and dive into the book itself and see what people like about it. Here's the map of Albion. You can see it's a pretty self-contained setting, a single page of hex paper. It's a grayscale map. I don't love that. It looks like maybe it was done in a color art program and then had to be turned into grayscale for, I don't know, I guess for DriveThruRPG purposes. I think I'd prefer just a black and white map at that point. But the first thing I want to focus on that's a real highlight here is the campaign structure. This is really innovative, and I wish more sandbox authors did this. Basically, you don't have to use this, but the author says, in the early part of the campaign, most of the plot hooks and the things the players are going to encounter take place in the South, and gives some guidance on the different factions and the story elements they'll engage with. And then as the players move into those mid-levels and they're ready to go out into the wild, they'll start exploring the North. They'll have a chance to encounter like the Druids, the Fae, and some of the storylines that take place a little further away from civilization. And then Act 3, that it's this like the high-level capstone where the players are able to penetrate the barriers around Camelot that are keeping it away from the world, and finally resolve the story with undead King Arthur and kind of these other figures, these other cursed figures from Arthurian lore. This is really clever, and actually I think advances the art of sandbox writing a little bit. I hadn't seen it anywhere else before, and I think a referee could make a lot of use of this campaign structure. Another example of a high point, let's take a look at this location, Caerluin. We see it's a bustling village resting in the shadow of the royal seat. There's not really a whole lot of meat there about the village. So if your players go there, they want to know if there's an inn or a tavern, marketplace, a place to buy equipment. You're going to have to embellish all that as a referee. However, what the author does do is use all of the space to talk about a current event going on in the village, and everything that's bolded either represents a faction, a plot hook, or another location in the hex crawl, tying this place to other things that can be encountered in the hex crawl. So in this case, the locations all do a really good job of referencing each other, which will drive the play forward in actual play. There's a sizable bestiary here. It's almost 30 pages. We're looking at the Black Knight, Sir Lancelot. The Black Knight is the undead, cursed form of Lancelot, who still rides on a mighty steed, blocks a bridge, and says, "None shall pass." What this bestiary reminded me of, actually, back in the 1980s, there was this book. Actually, I've got a copy, the Deities and Demigods Cyclopedia. It's a little controversial. It took all these real-world mythologies and gave them game stats. Now, in some cases, there were pantheons of deities, but they also did pantheons of heroes. And so there's a whole section of Arthurian characters in the old Deities and Demigods Cyclopedia. And this bestiary reminded me of that. It's got obscure figures, but a lot of different characters from Arthurian lore. So you might find that useful. It's rounded out with just folklore creatures that could appear in merry old Albion. There's an intro dungeon in the back of the book. It's the Tomb of the Headless Knight. You can look at the map here. It's basically a 5-room dungeon. In general, I don't love 5-room dungeons. I want things that are big, sprawling, 20, 30-room affairs with multiple factions and a bit of complexity to them. Here, the 5-room dungeon works pretty well as a kickoff or an introduction to all the themes of the campaign. If you use this to kick off your campaign, by the end of it, the players will be connected to the Robin Hood storyline. They'll have an opportunity to learn, or at least discover, that the Fae are infiltrating the Southlands in some capacity and are a threat. And the Headless Knight himself, his tomb is violated, so he arises from the dead, stomps out of the dungeon after killing a whole bunch of people, and heads out into the wilds, seeking the mythical Green Knight who took his head a century ago. No spoilers, but if you're familiar with Arthurian myth, you can guess who that is. I'm not going to deep dive them, but 2 things to take a look at from the contents here. Page 27, there's a chart around charity. So carousing, which is in the core rules as a way of getting extra experience in between adventures, has a very swords and sorcery vibe. You know, spending your money on booze and getting hammered and throwing a big party doesn't necessarily fit the chivalric theme. So here, instead, knightly characters can engage in gifts of charity and virtue instead. It's an alternate carousing approach. And you can see trinkets and treasures. It's about 8 pages worth of items. So all the various legendary named swords that the Arthurian characters carried around, or in some cases their shields or armor, are all statted up as artifacts and special items. In terms of drawbacks, there's 2. One's nitpicky. I've already said, hey, I'm not a big fan of the grayscale maps. Like, maybe that's more of a me problem and not a you problem. But take a look at this hex crawl description of the old mine. And there's a lot like this. We learn that the mine is a big sprawling place with many tunnels. One of them is a secret portal that leads to the other side of the hex map, where the druids are. Deep in the mines are the mythical crystal caves that Arthur used as his study. We're told that they hold fabulous treasures and deadly perils and traps, and that the mines themselves are now crawling with undead. So while the author does a good job of giving us a synopsis and overview of what the old mine is, keep in mind that this book is just a hex crawl setting. If you're going to use this as a referee, like, you've got to be willing to go create your own dungeons, for instance, like the old mine. You're going to want to spend some time turning it into an actual real dungeon, identifying for yourself, well, what is a fabulous treasure and what are arcane and elemental deadly perils. The author takes us part of the way, but keep in mind that the rest of the way is going to come from you, the referee. My verdict on this one, the concept's really good. I love the Arthurian and Robin Hood mashup. I think the narrative framework the author provides for the campaign is really innovative and maybe advances the art of hex crawls a little bit for us. And the high connectivity between all the different locations is really great as well. On the downside, this is a bare bones hex crawl, and so it'll require a fair amount of development and embellishment by the referee. So get this one if you love King Arthur and Robin Hood and aren't intimidated by cranking out your own dungeons. Or alternatively, if you just want to have a bestiary of all those high-level Arthurian figures. This one is $15 over on DriveThruRPG. We're going to change gears now and take a look at our second review of the day, also from Runeforged Tabletop Gaming. This one is The Wicked Witch of the Woods, and this presented as a one-shot. It describes a witch's cottage and cellar. There's a missing child. It's basically Hansel and Gretel, but without the Gretel, only Hans is missing. And the players are asked by the villagers to go rescue the child from the witch's cottage. I'm not sure I love this one. I don't think I'm the target audience. It's more of an introductory adventure. But as I really started to think about it, I came up with a great use case. So we'll talk about that when we get to the wrap up. From a map perspective, we're given a brief overview of the village of Waldheim where the players start. Here's the witch's cottage itself. Again, like my nitpick for Shadows of Camelot, the maps look like they were color textures that had to be converted to grayscale just for drive-through RPG purposes. And I think I might have preferred just black and white maps at that point. The gist of the scenario is to explore the cottage and the cellar and find the missing child before the witch comes back. That gives this one an express time limit and a sense of pressure. You've got a 3-hour game session or 3.5 hours game session. The players know they have to get in and get out. It's not too creepy. The monsters here are mostly vermin, so the players are going to be running into things like giant rats, some bats. There are a few creepy puppets and a giant spider in the cellar. One area it checks the box fairly well. There's definitely things to find, things to tinker with, some puzzle items to put together. So the cottage itself is interactive and a little interesting. So in terms of drawbacks, it's a little light on interior art. I've already pointed out the maps look like they're grayscale, and I think maybe just straight black and white maps would work better. This is clearly an introductory adventure. It almost feels like just a slightly expanded 5-room dungeon. So there's a pretty limited scale. There's no factions. I didn't find it very challenging. This would be one where perhaps your non-RPG playing significant other and some of their friends want to try out a tabletop RPG. And so you want something that's an accessible theme, like a folklore theme, but also not too dangerous. One other thing I'd point out while we're taking a look at the witch's cellar map here, on the opposite page, we've got the witch's bedroom and then the idea that there's a monster there called a lesser mimic. And there could be up to 3 of these mimics. They're actually a little dangerous, and I think they could be kind of creepy too. But we see in the game text that they have a vulnerability. They're sleepy. There actually is a music box in the cottage that if the players tinker with, they could find out that it makes people drowsy. Maybe if they're walking from room to room and opening up the music box, they might trip on the mimic's vulnerability. One thing I might do if I'm running this, I might just put a lullaby text on a sheet of paper right next to the witch's bed, so she never forgets to sing, I don't know, Hush Little Baby every night to her mimics and puts them to sleep. Essentially, for one of the more dangerous monsters here, where the author has built in a vulnerability to it, I might do a little bit more to signpost it. But that also gives you an example when I said that there are some interactive elements and some puzzles. Making that connection between the music box and the mimics is an example. So what's the verdict on this one? I've already mentioned, most likely it's meant to be an introductory adventure. But then the light bulb went off for me, and I realized that this would actually make a really solid Gauntlet. I'm a big fan of kicking off new campaigns with a Gauntlet. And when you're doing a Gauntlet, your experienced group of long-term RPG players are basically new people all over again. They're given a 0-level peasant with 1 hit point and none of the usual tools they have, and they've got to figure out their way through a compressed scenario. When you're running a Gauntlet, it's okay if it's fairly linear and time pressured and there's not a lot of faction play or anything like that. I think this scenario would be a really good gauntlet. There's a fair amount of death or opportunity for death. Creatures like giant spiders or those lesser mimics would be really difficult for 0 level peasants. And when I'm running a gauntlet, I love to treat it like a session 0. So I want it self-contained within one game session. And in between that game session and when we get together again, the players will go off and level up their characters. And in the campaign, you could skip like a year or several years. And the campaign begins with the reunion, where after the gauntlet, this guy went off and joined the army and spent time on campaign. That other character finished their studies in the temple. Someone else went and studied under a wizard. But when the players all come together, there's a reason why this experience of, in this case, exploring the witch's cottage, thrust them into the world in order to become leveled characters. Several weeks ago, I did a review of Curse Scroll #1, Diablerie. It's a Shadowdark Hex Crawl campaign, one of the official published campaigns by the Arcane Library. And it involves a folklore horror hex crawl with witches and hags and things like that. Actually, thematically, Wicked Witch of the Woods would work really well as a gauntlet kicking off a gloaming campaign. My one watch out about using this as a gauntlet would be this. Typically, 0-level peasants don't come into their gauntlet with a whole lot of stuff. And so they need to be able to pick up mundane items along the way. I would just juice the number of mundane items in the cottage. There's a table on page 41 of the main rules where you can put things like a pile of rope or a torch or a tinderbox in some of the rooms in the cottage. And then I think this would make a perfectly fine gauntlet. Wicked Witch of the Woods is $5 over on DriveThruRPG. Put a link to this one down below as well. Tell me what you think. For Wicked Witch in the Woods, are you in the market for an introductory adventure or gauntlet? Or how about that Arthurian hex crawl? Are you like me and you love the idea of a mashup of Robin Hood and undead King Arthur? Between the two of them, I'm actually a lot more likely to make use of the Wicked Witch of the Wood adventure. My wife has threatened to play a game at some point with some of her friends. I think that an introductory adventure could work there. When we wrap our current campaigns, I've thought about kicking off a campaign in the gloaming. I actually think Wicked Witch of the Woods would be a good gauntlet for that. If you made it this far, thanks for being here. Please consider subscribing. Next time I'll get back to some referee advice. However, I'm going to continue to include third-party Shadowdark materials in my channel. There's actually a lot out there. If there's a third-party Shadowdark supplement you'd like to see me talk about, drop a note below. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time. Thanks.